December 19th, 1944. A bitter wind scraped across the ruined city of Verdun, rattling the broken windows of an old French army barracks that had been turned into a command post. Inside, in a smoke-filled conference room lit by harsh winter daylight, the most powerful generals in the Allied world sat around a long wooden table. No one was smiling. Ashtrays overflowed. Coffee sat untouched. The air felt heavier than the stone walls. 3 days earlier, more than 200,000 German soldiers had slammed into the American lines in the Ardennes forest. The blow had come out of nowhere. Allied intelligence had been convinced that Germany was finished, that the Wehrmacht was exhausted, barely capable of local counterattacks. They had been wrong. Reports had poured in like a rising flood. American regiments overrun, battalions surrounded, command posts cut off, entire divisions disappearing from the map. Radio nets were breaking down. Roads were jammed with panicked traffic. A quiet sector that was supposed to be a rest area had turned into a killing ground. Now, in that cold room in Verdun, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, stared at the maps spread across the table. Red enemy arrows clawed deep into the thin American front. A bulge of German armor was driving west, threatening to split the Allied line in two. Near the center of the map, one name had been circled again and again in pencil: Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division was now surrounded there, cut off in a small Belgian town that controlled a web of vital roads. If Bastogne fell, if German tanks burst out from that junction, they could drive all the way to the Meuse River and maybe even reach the coast. The Allied armies in France and Belgium could be sliced apart like a rope cut in the middle. The situation was desperate, and everyone in that room knew it. Eisenhower looked up from the map and let his eyes travel slowly around the table. Omar Bradley, George Patton, Courtney Hodges. A roll call of men who commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They had led the victories in Normandy, in France, across Europe. Now they were fighting to prevent a catastrophe. Eisenhower's voice cut through the silence. "Gentlemen, how soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne?" The room went very, very quiet. The generals lowered their eyes to the paper in front of them. Their pencils moved, sketching rough lines, tracing distances, estimating fuel, roads, terrain. They weren't just looking at the map. They were doing brutal math in their heads. How long to disengage units that were already fighting? How many hours to pull them out of their current fronts without leaving gaps? How many days to turn entire corps around on icy, crowded roads? How much gasoline? How many trucks? How many bridges were still standing? It was winter. Snow and ice turned every mile into a hazard. Fog grounded plains. Armor moved slowly. The front was chaos. Some units didn't even know where all their battalions were. No one spoke. Then, from halfway down the table, a voice broke the silence. George S. Patton. He leaned forward, tapped the map with his finger, and spoke in his usual calm, flat tone, as if he were ordering lunch. "I can attack north with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Heads snapped up. Some generals stared at him in disbelief. Others glanced at each other, almost amused. It sounded insane. 48 hours? To pull fighting divisions out of contact, pivot a whole army 90 degrees, march over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through winter conditions, and then launch an organized attack against dug-in German forces? Operationally, it was impossible. Every man in that room knew it. They had all spent their careers learning how hard it was to move large formations under fire, to do it in 2 days, in the middle of winter, while the enemy was on the offensive. It sounded like pure Patton, aggressive, dramatic, over the top. Some thought he was joking. Some thought he was grandstanding. Some thought he was trying to impress Eisenhower with another outrageous promise. But George Patton wasn't smiling either. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't gambling. He was the only man in that room who had been waiting for this exact moment. Because Patton was the only general there who had seen this attack coming and had been quietly preparing for it for 11 days. 10 days earlier, December 9th, 1944. Nancy, France. Far from Verdun, in another commandeered building that now served as headquarters for the U.S. Third Army, A colonel walked down a corridor with a stack of papers in his hand and a knot in his stomach. His name was Oscar Koch, Patton's G2, his chief intelligence officer. Koch was not famous. He didn't command tanks or lead charges. He lived in maps, reports, intercepted messages, prisoner interrogations. He was meticulous, quiet, and stubborn. He had spent months tracing every German unit on the Western Front, following their movements like a hunter tracking footprints in snow. And lately, those footprints had led him to something that made his blood run cold. He stepped into Patton's office and laid the stack of reports on the desk. "General," he said, "we have a problem." Patton looked up from his paperwork. The room around him was cluttered with maps and operational plans. Third Army was pushing east, driving toward Germany. Patton was focused on attacking, always attacking. But when Oscar Koch spoke, he listened. "What is it, Oscar?" Patton asked. Koch spread a large situation map across the desk and began pointing with a pencil. "For weeks, we've been tracking German formations along the front," he said. "Infantry divisions, panzer divisions, Volksgrenadier units. I've been comparing our reports with what SHAEF intelligence is putting out." He tapped the map again. "And in the last few days, 15 German divisions have disappeared from our front." Patton raised an eyebrow. "Disappeared?" Koch nodded. "These aren't scraps of units. They're full-strength divisions, including several panzer divisions with hundreds of tanks. They've been pulled off the line. They're moving somewhere. But the higher headquarters say they're just being held in reserve, that they're waiting for our next big push, ready to counterattack anywhere we break through." Patton had heard the same explanation from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. To them, the missing divisions were a defensive measure, a reaction force. Nothing to panic about. But Koch shook his head. "General, the Wehrmacht doesn't pull 15 divisions off the front just to wait and see," he said quietly. "This is offensive strength. This is enough combat power to mount a major operation." He slid his finger across the map to a dense patch of green shading. The Ardennes. It didn't look like much, just a mass of forest and small roads, covering a stretch of the front that most commanders considered secondary. American divisions there were thinly spread, holding too many miles with too few men. 4 divisions were controlling a front that, under normal doctrine, should have needed 12. Koch continued. "This is the weak link in the Allied line. The terrain is terrible. Thick forest, steep ridges, narrow, twisting roads. In winter, it's almost impossible to move large forces quickly. SHAEF thinks that makes it safe. They assume no sane German commander would try to attack through here in December." He paused. "But the Germans have already done exactly that once before." Patton's mind jumped backward 4 years. The lightning strike through the Ardennes. German armor pouring through terrain everyone had declared impassable for tanks, bursting out onto the open ground, racing to the English Channel, cutting the French and British armies to pieces. The campaign that had conquered France had started in those same forests. Koch didn't need to say it. The memory hung between them like a ghost. He went on, methodical and relentless. "Radio traffic in the German sectors opposite the Ardennes has increased dramatically," he said. "We're hearing new call signs, new headquarters. Prisoners mention fresh units arriving. Belgian civilians are reporting more vehicle movements behind the lines. All of it points in one direction." He took a breath. "General, I believe the Germans are preparing a major counteroffensive. Their main blow will fall here, through the Ardennes, and their likely objectives are the Meuse River and the port of Antwerp." Patton stared at the map, silent for a long moment. Outside, trucks rumbled by. Phones rang in distant rooms. Third Army staff officers were planning how to keep pushing the Germans back, how to keep the offensive going. Patton's war had been moving one way, east. Now his intelligence officer was telling him the real danger lay to the north. Finally, Patton spoke. "If you're right," he asked quietly, "when do they strike?" Koch didn't hesitate. "Within the next 2 weeks. No bluster, no drama, just a cold professional assessment." Patton picked up the phone. He called Omar Bradley. his immediate superior, the man who commanded the 12th Army Group. Bradley listened as Patton laid out Koch's analysis. The missing divisions, the signals, the pattern, the Ardennes, the likely objectives. It all added up to one thing, a massive German counteroffensive. On the other end of the line, Bradley frowned. SHAEF intelligence didn't agree. They believed Germany was down to its last reserves, that Hitler might try a small jab here and there, but not a full-scale attack. The war, everyone kept saying, would be over soon. The Germans were beaten. They couldn't possibly risk everything on one desperate throw of the dice. Bradley was polite. He respected Patton, but in the end he gave the answer the big-picture analysts in the rear had given him. "George, don't worry about it. The Germans don't have that kind of strength left." Patton hung up the phone slowly. He looked at Oscar Koch, standing in front of his desk. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gave an order that would quietly change the course of the war. "Start planning." Over the next 10 days, while most of the Allied world drifted toward what they thought would be a quiet Christmas, Patton's headquarters became the center of a secret storm. Behind closed doors, away from curious eyes, Patton's staff began to write plans, not for their current offensive, but for a battle that hadn't started yet. They didn't write one plan, they wrote three. 3 complete contingency operations for a German breakthrough in the Ardennes. Every route was studied, every bridge was marked, every fuel dump was calculated. When would units have to move? Which roads would they use? Which corps would turn? Which divisions would lead? If the German attack developed in one direction, 3rd Army would execute Plan A. If it pushed another way, Plan B. If the situation turned into something unexpected, Plan C. Truck routes were sketched down to the mile. Fuel supplies were identified and quietly pre-positioned. Artillery batteries were designated for rapid redeployment. Infantry formations were assigned specific roads and assembly areas they had never seen, but would be ready to occupy at short notice. The level of detail was obsessive. To most of the staff, it felt insane. 3rd Army was fighting its own battles in the Saar region. They were attacking, not retreating. They were pushing into Germany. Every instinct, every order, everything Patton was famous for screamed, "Go forward, hit harder, don't stop." And yet, in a back room, his planners were working late into the night on a completely different scenario. A sudden emergency 100 miles to the north, in a sector that technically wasn't even their responsibility. Whispers began to circulate. Had the old man finally lost it? Why were they planning for a disaster that might never come? Why were they diverting energy from their own offensive? The answer was simple. Because George Patton trusted Oscar Koch more than he trusted the comfortable assumptions coming out of SHAEF. On December 12th, Patton gathered his senior commanders. Maps were rolled out. Cigarettes were lit. The men expected another briefing about the attack into Germany. Instead, Patton looked them in the eye and gave a different kind of order. "At any moment," he said, "you may receive instructions to disengage and move north. When that happens, I don't want arguments. I don't want delays. You will be ready to break off your operations and pivot immediately." He didn't tell them exactly why. He didn't explain Koch's analysis, or the missing divisions, or the Ardennes. He just told them to be prepared. Around the table, officers exchanged glances. Disengage? When they were winning? When momentum was finally on their side? It made no sense. But they were Patton's men, and Patton's men followed orders. By December 15th, 1944, 3rd Army was the only major American formation in Europe that had detailed contingency plans for a massive German offensive in the Ardennes. Everyone else was focused on their own sectors. Everyone else believed the war was almost over. Everyone else was planning for Christmas. 3rd Army was planning for a storm, and it was about to hit. 5:30 a.m., December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest exploded. Along an 80-mile stretch of front, German artillery opened up with a roar that shook the frozen ground. Thousands of shells screamed through the darkness, crashing into American positions, tearing through trenches, gun pits, and command posts. Phones went dead. Radios crackled. Men were blown out of their beds. In the brief silence after the barrage, another sound rolled out of the woods. Engines, tracks, the clank and grind of tanks. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, surged forward against just 4 thinly spread American divisions. Units that had been resting in what they thought was a quiet sector suddenly found themselves in the path of a sledgehammer. To most of the Allied command, it was unthinkable. To Eisenhower's headquarters, the first report sounded like an exaggerated local counterattack. To Omar Bradley's staff, the size of the assault seemed impossible. But in one headquarters, far from the shell-torn front, the reaction was different. When the first messages came in, George Patton didn't look surprised. He looked at Oscar Koch. "You were right," he said quietly. "What's their objective?" And as Koch began to answer, the one army in Europe that was truly ready for this nightmare started to move. Dawn never really arrived on December 16th, 1944. In the Ardennes, the sky just shifted from black to a dirty gray while the forest shook under the weight of German artillery. Along roughly 80 miles of front, American positions were hammered without warning. Men who had gone to sleep thinking they were in a quiet sector woke up under a rain of steel. Communications, trenches collapsed, timber supports snapped, radios and field telephones went dead as wires were shredded. Then, after that first terrible barrage, another sound rolled out of the woods. Engines, tracks, the grinding advance of tanks and half-tracks. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, pushed forward against only 4 scattered American divisions. In some places, the ratio was nearly 4 to 1. Units that had been sent to the Ardennes to rest or gain their first gentle taste of combat found themselves in the path of a full-scale onslaught designed to smash the entire Allied line. Fog hung low over the forest, muting visibility and grounding Allied aircraft. Patrols stumbled back from the front, shouting conflicting reports. German infantry had broken through here. Tanks had been sighted there. Roadblocks were being overrun. Bridges were under attack. Small command posts simply vanished under the pressure. At first, in the higher headquarters safely to the rear, the initial messages were brushed aside. It must be a local counterattack, a spoiling thrust, the last angry swing of a beaten enemy. At Supreme Headquarters, staff officers frowned at the reports and filed them under incomplete information. This wasn't what their analysis had predicted, so they tried to make the facts fit the forecast. The Germans were supposed to be exhausted. They were supposed to be on the defensive. They weren't supposed to have the strength to mount anything big. But as the hours went by, reality refused to cooperate. More calls, more reports, more gaps opening in the American line. Regiments were being encircled. Some lost contact with their neighbors entirely. Artillery units fired until they ran out of shells and then tried to fight as infantry. Quiet villages suddenly found themselves at the center of furious firefights. Road junctions, the lifeblood of any army in winter, became critical objectives, contested meter by meter. One division, the 106th Infantry, had just arrived in the Ardennes. Its men had been told this would be a relatively calm sector, a place to acclimate, a place to learn the front before facing serious resistance. Instead, they were hit by the leading edge of the German assault. Under the weight of the attack, parts of the 106th were shattered. 2 entire regiments, cut off and surrounded, ultimately surrendered. It would become the largest single mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. For the officers at First Army and SHAEF, it was a shock that shattered the illusion that this was just a minor disruption. Suddenly, the word everyone had been avoiding began to surface in hushed conversations. Breakthrough. Maps were pulled back out. Red arrows were extended. The bulge in the Allied line began to grow. While all of this was unfolding in a blur of panic and confusion elsewhere, the reaction at Third Army headquarters was different. When the first clear reports reached George Patton, he didn't pace the room or curse the analysts. He didn't pretend it was nothing. He didn't insist it was just a small push. He called his intelligence officer. Oscar Koch stepped up to the map. "They've hit us in the Ardennes," Patton said. "Where are they going?" Koch scanned the developing situation. reading the shape of the attack like a man reading handwriting he'd seen before. "They're driving for the road network," he said. "Bastogne is the key. If they take that junction, they can push toward the Meuse, and beyond that, Antwerp." Patton nodded once. That was all he needed. "Get me General Gaffey," he said. "We're executing the contingency plans." Those quiet 10 days of insane planning, the 3 carefully crafted options that staff officers had complained about behind closed doors, they were no longer theory. They were the only things standing between a German breakthrough and complete disaster. As other American headquarters scrambled simply to understand what was happening, Third Army began to move. Orders went out to begin disengaging from offensive operations in the Saar. Commands that had been focused entirely on pushing east were suddenly told to prepare to pivot north. Staff officers grabbed the contingency binders they had almost mocked. Now, every chart and timetable inside them became priceless. Patton wasn't improvising a miracle. He was activating a plan. And that made all the difference. For 3 days, while most Allied commanders tried to claw their way out of denial and confusion, Patton's army quietly shifted gears. Units were warned. Routes were reviewed. Fuel stocks earmarked for one direction were reassigned for another. Convoys were put on alert. By December 19th, the crisis could no longer be downplayed. The German offensive had carved a deep wound into the Allied front. American units had been pushed back, enveloped, crushed. The bulge in the lines was growing like a spreading infection, threatening to split the Allied armies and roll them back toward the sea. It was time for a reckoning. In that converted barracks at Verdun, Eisenhower had summoned every senior field commander he could get to the table. The atmosphere, as they gathered, was grim. Everyone had seen the maps. Everyone had heard the casualty reports. Many had watched units they'd carefully built up vanish under the weight of the German attack. Yet when Eisenhower opened the meeting, what he said surprised them. He didn't start with panic. He didn't start with blame. He started with a perspective. The German army, he pointed out, had finally left its prepared defensive positions. It had surged forward. Its supply lines were stretching. Its flanks were exposed. Its armor was plunging into terrain and weather that would punish any delay. This was dangerous, yes, but it was also an opportunity. If the Allies could react fast enough, they could turn this blow into the German army's final overextension. But there was a cruel catch. Responding quickly was exactly what seemed impossible. The Allied forces were not arranged for a rapid counterthrust. They were lined up for their own offensives, pointed east toward Germany, not north toward the Ardennes Bulge. Supply depots, fuel dumps, and artillery positions were all oriented in the wrong direction. Units were tied up in ongoing operations. The roads were choked with traffic, refugees, and retreating elements from shattered formations. To strike fast, someone would have to do something that, on paper, should not be possible. Disengage large forces from combat, turn them around, march them through night and winter and chaos, and have them arrive in fighting shape at exactly the point of crisis. And that was why Eisenhower asked the question that hung in the air like a sentence, how soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? The silence that followed was heavy. Each commander's mind ran through the brutal arithmetic. To break off contact without collapsing their fronts. To gather scattered units and form them into a coherent force. To find the fuel, the trucks, the clear roads. To coordinate it all under relentless time pressure. They flipped through notes, traced potential axes of advance with their fingers, and realized the same thing. Everything was in the wrong place. No one rushed to answer. The Ardennes bulge on the map wasn't just a set of arrows. It was a clock. Every hour that passed, the German timetable advanced. Every day that Bastogne stood isolated, the 101st Airborne bled and rationed what little they had left. If relief came late, or not at all, German armor could smash through the weak points and turn a crisis into a catastrophe. The men around the table knew this. What they didn't know was how to move fast enough to stop it. Then Patton spoke. "I can attack north with 2 divisions in 48 hours, he said, and a third in 72. The room froze. There was no laughter this time. No one mistook him for joking, not with the stakes this high, but the disbelief was palpable. To some, it sounded like the old George, the man who made aggressive promises and then bullied reality until it gave way. To others, it sounded like fantasy, wishful thinking. Disengage divisions already in combat. Rotate a whole army roughly 90 degrees. Move more than 100,000 men, plus their tanks, trucks, and artillery, across icy roads in midwinter. Then launch a coordinated attack against an enemy who had spent days entrenching and preparing to receive them. All in 2 days. It defied every cautious calculation the other generals were making in their heads. Eisenhower narrowed his eyes. "George," he said, "this isn't the moment for theatrics. The 101st is surrounded. If we promise them relief and fail to deliver, those men die. I need the truth, not bravado." Patton didn't fidget. He didn't look away. "Ike," he answered, "I've already given the orders. Third Army is beginning to disengage now. I have 3 contingency plans ready. I've been expecting a German attack like this for 11 days. Around the table, a new kind of silence replaced disbelief. Expecting it, the same offensive that had blindsided entire army groups, that had slipped 15 divisions off the line under the noses of Allied intelligence, that had shattered the 106th and torn open the front, and this man claimed he had been preparing for it in advance? For a moment, Eisenhower just studied him. He had known Patton for a long time. He knew the difference between Patton's theatrics and Patton's seriousness. This wasn't bluff. There was no show in his eyes now, only cold commitment. Finally, Eisenhower nodded. "All right, George," he said quietly. "Go." The moment the meeting adjourned, Patton didn't linger to discuss theories or assign blame. He didn't waste time explaining himself to doubters. He headed straight for a phone and called his chief of staff at Third Army headquarters. The message he sent was astonishingly simple for what it unleashed. "Play ball." 2 words, but those 2 words lit up the network of plans that had been sitting waiting inside Third Army like a coiled spring. Within minutes, the orders began to cascade through the chain of command. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's Hammer, was to begin moving north at once. The 26th Infantry Division would follow. A 3rd Division was warned to prepare for rapid disengagement and redeployment as soon as conditions allowed. Truck columns that had been quietly earmarked during the planning phase roared to life. Fuel depots that had been just in case suddenly became lifelines. Artillery units received movement instructions to new firing positions aligned with the relief axis toward Bastogne. Over 133,000 vehicles would eventually take part in the pivot. Tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, trucks loaded with infantry, ambulances, fuel carriers, maintenance vehicles, everything an army needed to move and fight. Roads that had been charted on maps in the back rooms of headquarters were now written into reality with tire tracks in the snow. At other Allied headquarters, officers were still arguing about how big the German offensive really was, about whose fault the intelligence failure might be, about how to salvage the plans they'd been so sure of only a week before. At Third Army headquarters, there was no time for that. Every route was already chosen, every fuel point already marked, every unit already assigned to a place in the long, snaking columns that would push north through winter and darkness. Patton wasn't conjuring an impossible manner out of thin air. He was doing the one thing the enemy never expected, executing a plan that had been ready before the first German gun had fired. Under the cover of darkness on December 19th, 1944, the Third Army began to move, an entire army wrenching itself, free from its own offensive and pivoting north like a steel giant turning on command. Soldiers who had been fighting eastward only a day before were now marching in the opposite direction through icy winds. Tank engines rumbled to life. Headlights were blacked out. Convoys crept through narrow, snow-choked roads, following a choreography that had been written by Patton's staff more than a week earlier. The scale of the movement was almost beyond imagination. More than 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, endless lines of tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition trucks, fuel carriers, and supply jeeps stretched out for miles through the frozen countryside. At intersections, Military police directed traffic with silent hand signals, illuminated only by the faint reflections of snow. Every vehicle had a place in the order of march. Every mile was timed. Every halt was calculated. What looked like chaos to an outsider was actually a meticulously engineered machine in motion. While Third Army surged north, the situation in the Dionis worsened by the hour. Bastogne remained the hinge on which the entire German attack turned. The 101st Airborne Division, along with armored and infantry elements that had been caught in the area, were now completely encircled. German forces had cut every road and fired artillery from all sides. Supplies were dwindling. Some paratroopers had only a handful of rounds left for their rifles. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Snow was being melted in helmets for water. The town itself was a frozen skeleton, shattered buildings, burning vehicles, streets choked with rubble. The only warmth came from burning debris and the breath of exhausted men in foxholes. The paratroopers fought room by room, street by street, holding back superior numbers with sheer stubbornness. There was no escape, no fallback. All they could do was dig in and hope that relief would reach them in time. On December 22nd, the Germans sent a delegation under a white flag to the American lines outside Bastogne. They carried a typed ultimatum demanding the immediate surrender of the garrison. In return, they promised humane treatment for prisoners and avoidance of unnecessary suffering. Brigadier General Anthony Cauliflower read the surrender demand and laughed. His official reply consisted of a single word: nuts. That one word echoed through the frozen streets, through foxholes and aid stations. It became the spirit of Bastogne, defiant, unbreakable, absurdly American. The paratroopers knew they were nearly out of everything, but they also knew that somewhere out there, someone was coming for them. They didn't know who, they didn't know when. They only knew that the 101st Airborne didn't surrender, and Patton didn't let men die without a fight. Back at Third Army headquarters, the movement north continued without pause. Patton slept only minutes at a time. His staff worked in rotating shifts, guiding the massive columns around traffic jams, broken-down tanks, and frozen bridges. Snowstorms slowed everything. Vehicles skidded off the road. Fuel trucks got stuck on narrow mountain passes. Artillery tractors struggled to pull heavy guns through drifts that rose to a man's chest. But the army kept moving. On the night of the 20th, temperatures dropped so low that oil thickened in engines. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and overcoats while shivering in open trucks. Frostbite cases spiked. Still, the columns advanced, crawling closer to the sounds of battle rumbling from the north. By December 21st, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of Patton's relief force, were nearing their attack positions. They had covered more than 100 miles in less than 48 hours, while disengaging from combat and fighting brutal winter conditions. It was a feat no other general had even attempted, let alone achieved. Every man in that vanguard knew what was at stake. Bastogne was dying. The surrounded troops were holding by their fingernails. Any delay meant the Germans could crush the pocket before relief arrived. At sunrise on December 22nd, Patton ordered the attack. The 4th Armored Division roared forward, tanks grinding through snow-covered fields and icy roads. German forces were waiting. Every approach to Bastogne had been fortified. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions. Mortars hammered the advancing infantry. Machine guns cut through the cold air like buzzing saws. The fighting was savage. Tank duels erupted at point-blank ranges. Companies were pinned by fire and clawed their way forward foot by foot. Snow turned black with smoke and red with blood. Villages along the road to Bastogne became battlegrounds, each house cleared with grenades and rifle fire, each street taken only after bitter resistance. Patton's men didn't stop. Behind the armored spearhead, the infantry slogged through frozen woods. Artillery rolled up behind them, firing continuously to keep the German defenses off balance. Engineers cleared mines in the snow with frozen fingers. Medics dragged wounded men through drifts that swallowed their boots. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne fought on, firing their last rounds, rationing their last bandages. They listened to the distant echoes of artillery, trying to guess whether the sounds meant Patton was getting closer or that the German noose was tightening. By December 23rd, the sky opened for the first time in days. Clear weather finally allowed Allied aircraft to take off. C-47 transport planes roared in low over the town, dropping ammunition, medical supplies, food, and even radio batteries. Fighters and bombers struck German columns, smashing tanks that were trying to reinforce the siege. The ground shook with explosions. The paratroopers cheered, but still, the 4th Armored Division had to fight its way through every mile. On December 24th and 25th, German counterattacks slammed into Patton's leading elements. Panthers and Tigers maneuvered in the forests. Infantry in white camouflage ambushed American units. Mortar shells burst in the trees, sending deadly splinters raining down. The relief force was battered, bogged down, and nearly cut off more than once. Christmas Day passed in smoke and fire. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers celebrated with whatever they had: cold rations, weak coffee, and a single message passed around from foxhole to foxhole: Patton is coming. On December 26, 1944, at 4:50 p.m., a tank named Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, smashed through the final German positions at Eisenhower. As it rolled forward, an American paratrooper appeared from the woods, waving wildly. The siege of Bastogne had been broken. Patton heard the message and immediately called Eisenhower. "We're through to Bastogne." Those 5 words signaled one of the greatest rescue maneuvers in modern military history. But the corridor was narrow, and German forces struck the flanks relentlessly. Patton's men had to widen the breach, secure the roads, and hold the line while supply convoys poured into the battered town. Trucks rolled through the gap carrying ammunition, fuel, blankets, plasma, and desperately needed reinforcements. The 101st Airborne had held for 8 brutal days against overwhelming numbers. Now, at last, they had what they needed to fight on. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on for another month, in blizzards and bloodshed, across forests and frozen fields. But the German timetable, the critical window on which their entire offensive relied, was shattered the moment Patton's men reached Bastogne. Hitler's boldest gamble had failed. Not because Germany lacked strength, not because Allied intelligence was perfect, not because the situation was easy. It failed because one general had prepared 11 days before the attack began, and because an army followed a plan no one else believed was necessary. And in war, that difference is everything. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the Battle of the Bulge. It was only the moment the tide finally turned. But the deeper story, the one few people truly understand, lay not in the tanks that broke through or the paratroopers who held the line. It lay in the quiet failure that had allowed the disaster to happen, and in the single moment of foresight that had stopped it from becoming far worse. In the days after Bastogne was relieved, the full scale of the German plan became clearer. Captured documents, interrogated officers, and recovered maps revealed just how ambitious Hitler's offensive had been. The Germans had expected their shock attack to break through the American front within the first 48 hours. They believed their armored spearheads would reach the Meuse River in 4 days. They believed Antwerp, the vital supply port of the Allied armies, could be captured within 2 weeks. If they reached Antwerp, the Allied war effort would collapse into chaos. The British and American armies would be split apart. Supply lines would fail. The momentum that had driven the Allies across France might have stalled permanently. The war in Europe could have dragged on for months, perhaps even years. The Germans had anticipated panic, confusion, paralysis, and at almost every headquarters across the Allied line, they got exactly that. Everywhere except Third Army. By now, as the shock of the offensive faded, senior commanders began asking hard questions. How had 15 German divisions disappeared from the front without anyone noticing? How had Allied intelligence failed so completely? Why had so many reports been dismissed? Why had entire sectors been left undermanned, under-strength, and under-prepared? The answer was painfully simple. Someone had noticed. Oscar Koch Patton's quiet, meticulous G2 had tracked every one of those divisions. He had built charts, compared signals, studied prisoner reports, and observed patterns no one else bothered to see. He had warned of a major offensive. He had identified the exact sector of attack. He had predicted the timing within days. And he had been ignored. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had made a fatal assumption that Germany was finished, incapable of major action. They interpreted every piece of evidence through the lens of that belief. If something didn't fit the expectation, they explained it away rather than question the assumption. But Koch had made no such assumption. He followed the facts. He let the data speak, even when it whispered something no one wanted to hear. Yet intelligence is only as valuable as the commander who trusts it. When Koch briefed Patton, the general didn't scoff or argue. He didn't cling to what was convenient. He didn't fight the evidence because it made his plans uncomfortable. He listened, and then he acted. He wrote contingency plans when everyone else was preparing for victory parades. He warned his commanders to be ready for sudden disengagement, while others were decorating mess halls for Christmas. He positioned fuel dumps, mapped alternate roads, and quietly synchronized logistics while other armies were planning final pushes into Germany. The brilliance of Patton wasn't just in his aggression on the battlefield, it was in the humility he showed in his headquarters. He trusted the man who saw the danger. When the offensive erupted on December 16th, Third Army didn't panic. They didn't scramble. They didn't hold emergency councils trying to interpret the impossible. They didn't wait for better reports or fuller information. They executed. The 4th Armored Division moved out. The 26th followed. The 80th prepared to swing behind them. Supply officers rerouted convoys. Staff officers unrolled plans drafted 11 days earlier, now treating every detail like scripture. The army turned itself like a giant rotating machine complex, heavy but perfectly timed. German commanders later admitted the truth. They had counted on American slowness. They had counted on confusion. They had counted on days of paralysis. They expected at least 1 week before the Americans could mount a serious counterattack. Patton hit them in 4 days. General Gunther Belittlement, of the German High Command, would later write that Patton was the most aggressive panda general of the Allies, the only commander who reacted with the speed and violence of a German armored leader. General Lasso on Mantelshelf, who commanded the 5th Panda Army during the Dearness Offensive, said it even more plainly. We knew Patton would react quickly. We did not know he had prepared for our attack. That single sentence captures the entire Battle of the Bulge. The German plan didn't fail because it lacked power. It didn't fail because their troops weren't skilled. It didn't fail because their tanks weren't deadly. It failed because a quiet intelligence officer saw the attack coming, and because his general believed him. After the battle, honors and decorations were handed out across the Allied armies. The 101st Airborne became legends for their stand at Bastogne. The tank crews of the 4th Armored Division were celebrated for breaking the siege. Patton was praised, but no special medal marked his achievement. His role was acknowledged, but not immortalized. As for Oscar Koch, outside of certain military circles, his name disappeared into the footnotes of history. Yet among professionals, among those who understood the real mechanics of war, Koch became a symbol of what intelligence is meant to be and what it must never become. He taught that information is useless if filtered through wishful thinking. He taught that assumptions kill. He taught that truth ignored is a truth wasted. Patton taught the complementary lesson that preparation is the difference between disaster and victory that looks like a miracle. In staff colleges, decades after the war, military officers would study the Dearness Offensive not just as a German gamble or an American crisis, but as a case study in leadership. In understanding that intelligence isn't always comfortable, that warnings are only valuable when they're believed, and that preparation is not pessimism, it is survival. The official histories would call the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement the U.S. Army fought in World War II. More than 19,000 Americans were killed, tens of thousands were wounded or captured, entire units were shattered. Snow-covered forests became graveyards. The price was horrific, and yet the price could have been far higher. If Bastogne had fallen, if the German timetable had held, if Patton had not prepared, the Allied armies might have been split apart. The road to victory might have stretched months longer. The war might have taken a darker turn. But that didn't happen, because one general believed in the one man who saw the storm coming, because one commander acted before anyone else realized they needed to, because one army moved when everyone else froze. The Battle of the Bulge was a failure of intelligence at the strategic level, but also a triumph of intelligence at the tactical one. A warning ignored by many, but heeded by the one man whose response mattered most. In the end, Patton stood apart not because he was the fastest or the fiercest, but because he was prepared. And in war, when the fog is thickest, when the stakes are highest, when the world hangs on the thin line between disaster and salvation, preparation is not merely an advantage, it is everything.